Hi everyone. In this video and the next couple of videos, I'd like to do a series on different defences that we have. So one of them will be about standard defences that we all know about, which is minimalising, denial, those kind of things. The second one will be about avoidance and how we end up avoiding lots of things in our lives for various reasons. The third one will be about our mammalian defences that we use, which are fight, flight, freeze, submit and attach. And then the fourth one will be about boundaries. So when we can't set a boundary, how do we set a boundary? So there's lots of different ways that we might do this. So how do you say no when you can't say no? So that's what my next 4 videos are going to be about, because it's really important to understand this concept of defences and how defended we are a lot of the time, especially when we've come from a narcissistic background and that psychological warfare. Then we're going to have lots of different kinds of defences. So as we become more self-aware, it's good to learn about all these things so that we can be more self-aware, understand ourselves better, get to a place where we accept ourselves and we're more healed from the horror that we've lived through when we've come from a narcissistic family. So this first video then is about the basic defences. So let's go over to my website, which is called childrenofnarcissists.org.uk, to have a look at an article over there, which is called Defence Mechanisms. Let's go and have a look. Common types of defence mechanisms. There are many types of defence mechanisms which we use when feeling the need to protect ourselves. Some are primitive and some are more sophisticated. Some are more obvious, while others are so well hidden from our conscious mind we may have no idea they are there unless we undergo therapy or extensive inner work. So sometimes we can know that we drink a lot, for example, but kind of be in denial to what extent we drink, but it's somehow in our conscious mind. But then other things are really well buried. We don't have any idea they're there until we've worked through those layers, worked down the layers of the onion. Therapy can help us to find the strength and resilience to enforce healthy boundaries and to no longer need unconscious defense mechanisms. So most people have heard of many of these. A lot of these are introduced by Freud, so some of his ideas were not that great, some were terrible, but some of the work he did was good, and he did good work around some of defences. So primitive defences, these are the first defences to occur developmentally. Denial. Denial is the refusal to accept reality or fact, acting as if a painful event, thought or feeling did not exist. It is characteristic of early childhood development. Many people use denial to avoid dealing with painful feelings or areas of their life they don't wish to face. It's a form of repression. An example of this would be a person who drinks every day and is therefore dependent on alcohol and states that they are just drinking to relax or to have fun is in denial. This one we're pretty familiar with, aren't we? Regression. Regression is the return to an earlier stage of development in the face of unacceptable thoughts or impulses. It arises from anxiety and it can occur during times of stress. A well-known example would be an older child who reverts to sucking their thumb or bedwetting during a stressful time or following a trauma. And then in relationships, regression can take the form of a person having a temper tantrum when they do not get their own way, as they are unable to communicate their needs in a mature way. Acting out, which is also known as repetition compulsion. Acting out is performing an extreme behaviour in order to express thoughts or feelings the person feels incapable of otherwise expressing. The behaviours will usually be considered bad or antisocial and are generally destructive to either the self or to others. Feelings are translated into actions rather than being felt. It is an unconscious process. In acting out, as defined by Freud, his patients were acting out when they could not access the repressed memories that were motivating their unconscious behaviours, and they symbolically dramatised the past in order not to remember it. And there's an article I'll put a link to in the video description, which addresses repetition compulsion, which is really interesting. And especially it's interesting to read that when we come from a narcissistic family and then we found ourselves being married to or in relationships with narcissists. Why is that happening? Why are we repeating a pattern that was so painful that logic might say, why would you ever have a narcissistic parent and then go on to marry or have relationships with narcissists? So there's acting out there and there's this repetition compulsion, which can be really helpful to understand. So an example of repetition compulsion would be someone who has an emotionally distant parent and goes on to have relationships in adulthood with people who are also emotionally distant is acting out. Dissociation. People who have a history of any kind of childhood abuse often develop some form of dissociation. So dissociation is normal, it's on a spectrum, it runs from daydreaming right down to DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. This can be defined as detaching from reality in some way. Some symptoms of dissociation are a sense of fragmentation or division of the self. This can be felt like different mood states, also known as coping mechanisms, or extreme emotions being triggered and experiencing too much or too little emotionally and physically. So when we're often hyper aroused, so we're feeling anxious, or we're hypo-aroused, which is a flat state, which is more of a numbness or a depression. So these are triggered states, and we're triggered into the mammalian defenses there, which I will go into in another video. Derealization and depersonalization. These are both under the umbrella of dissociation. Derealization, which means we feel alienated from our surroundings, is the sensation that a person's surroundings are not real. They may feel like they are watching themselves or they are in a film or a play. And depersonalization, which is alienation from the self, is the feeling that a person's body is not real. They may feel numb or disconnected from themselves. They may feel that their life is not really happening to them at times. And they may feel like they are robotic. So these aspects are likely to come and go. So the derealization and depersonalization will be there at some times, probably not all the time. These variations on dissociation can be mild or severe. An example of dissociation is a marked change in mood. For example, someone becoming very angry very quickly in a way that is sudden, intense, and disproportionate to the situation the person is in. They are then unable to talk themselves down, and the mood may last for hours or days. So some people might have the idea of a dissociation as being kind of spaced out or a bit catatonic or not really there. But it can take other different forms, such as these mood states. And I'll also put a link in the description to an article I have about dissociation. So it can be interesting to have a look at that as well. Compartmentalization. This is a lesser form of dissociation. Parts of oneself are separated from and unaware of other parts, and this means a person can behave as though they hold two different sets of values. This is the root of hypocritical thinking and cognitive dissonance. So it's quite easy to see hypocrisy in other people, isn't it? It is also the ability to put our personal issues aside whilst at work so that we can function effectively in life. So an example of compartmentalization, a person who campaigns on environmental issues and then regularly flies around the world in a private jet is behaving as though they have two opposing sets of values. So this is something that we see a lot in the newspapers, isn't it? People saying the elites and the wealthy jet around the world in their private planes speaking about climate change when their actions would contradict the things that they're talking about and the ideas that they're believing in. So that's a good example, modern day example of compartmentalization. Projection. Projection is the act of ascribing a person's undesired thoughts, feelings, or impulses onto another person who does not have those thoughts, feelings, or impulses. A person sees their own faults or things they do not like about themselves in others. So someone who lies a lot might be going around accusing other people of being liars all the time. An example of projection here: a father who was not successful in his career in the way he wanted may project onto his son by telling him that he will not amount to anything, or there is no point in trying hard in life. Minimization. This defense is very similar to denial and can be a conscious or unconscious process. Minimization occurs when we compare ourselves to others and judge that our situation is not as bad as theirs, or we tell ourselves that what has happened to us is not that bad. A person who is verbally bullying someone may say that they were only joking. This gives them plausible deniability and they can escape any consequences. If a person is complimented or praised, perhaps for achieving something difficult, they may respond with, "It was nothing," or "Anyone can do it." So we can minimize things in lots of different ways, minimize our own achievements, minimize our feelings, minimize what other people are doing. This is really common for children of narcissists. If a parent's default response to their child being upset is to tell their child that they are overly sensitive or dramatic, the parent is minimizing the child's feelings and perspective. So we see this also going on a lot in narcissistic families, don't we? Narcissistic parents do this, and this is part of the gaslighting people feel happening, that their version of reality is not a true one, and that the narcissistic parents' version of reality is the one that is pushed and that we have to go along with. So this is one of the roots of gaslighting. Repression. Repression is the unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and impulses. Unpleasant or traumatic experiences are buried in the subconscious, and the conscious mind is unaware of them. This protects the conscious mind from memories or feelings which are very painful or overwhelming. An example would be a person who is involved in a serious car accident and they don't remember the details. So when a person's come from a narcissistic household, there's going to be a lot of repression happening so that people can continue to function. Because growing up in such an environment where so many awful things are happening all the time, to be able to function, there needs to be this defense in place. Displacement. Displacement happens when a person redirects an emotional reaction from the rightful recipient onto another person or object. It often involves anger, and it is displaced onto a less threatening person because it is safer or easier. An example of this would be when a woman who is shouted at by her boss at work goes home and shouts at her children and her partner. She is displacing her anger at her boss onto them. So this is something that happens really often in society as well. We can see this all over the place. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is the overemphasis on thinking. A person might employ intellectualization to distance themselves from an impulse, event, or behaviour. A person can avoid their emotions by focusing on the intellect. So some people are quite aware that they really live in their heads. An example of this would be a man who has lost his wife may focus his attention and energy on the funeral arrangements instead of acknowledging his grief. Rationalisation. Rationalisation is an unconscious attempt to avoid addressing the underlying reasons for a behaviour. An example is a person who is often late for work might rationalise that they are bad at time management when the underlying reason might be that they dislike their job or the people that they're working with. So there are a couple of mature defences. The following defence mechanisms are more mature and are the most constructive and helpful, but may require practice and effort to put into daily use. People with mature defences tend to be more at peace with themselves and those around them. And then a point to make here would be, if you've come from a really dysfunctional background or a traumatic background, then you're going to have to work through lots of the unprocessed trauma there before you may be able to get to this place where you can have mature defences. So it's not an easy task. Sublimation. Sublimation is similar to displacement, and it is the channeling of unacceptable impulses, thoughts and emotions into more acceptable ones. This can be seen in sport, art, music and humour. And I'll put a link below to an article by Learning Mind, which goes into sublimation a bit more in depth. An example of this would be a person with an obsessive need for control can channel those needs into becoming a successful administrator. Compensation. Compensation can be a mature defense mechanism if it is utilized effectively. People can compensate for their perceived weaknesses by developing and emphasizing strength in other areas of themselves or their lives. When the compensatory response is excessive, it is described as overcompensation. An example of this is a man who is insecure about his body or looks may compensate by working hard and becoming wealthy. So then he can attract a partner that way. And assertive communication. An individual is successfully assertive when being clear in communication without the need to be aggressive and blunt. They express their opinions or needs in a respectful yet firm manner and listen when they are being spoken to. Becoming more assertive is one of the most desired communication skills and is a helpful and mature defense. An example would be a person in the workplace asks a co-worker for something they need without apologizing for asking. Now, assertive communication is going to be the end goal for people who've come from narcissistic families, but there's a lot to work through before you can get there. So there's going to be exactly what the fourth video in this is going to be about, which is the inability to set boundaries. How do we do that? So there are many dysfunctional ways that we set boundaries because we can't communicate assertively. There's a block in us that stops us from being able to communicate in that way because of behavioural conditioning in childhood. So this is the ideal, but it's going to take a while to get there. It's going to take a long time to get there, and don't be too hard on yourself. If you struggle to set boundaries and you struggle to communicate assertively, this is the ideal, which is hard to reach, and there's a lot to work through first. So that's the end of this video, which is about common defense mechanisms. Lots of interesting stuff in there. It might be things that we're all familiar with already, no new information, but useful to keep in mind that these things are happening a lot of the time, and with a lot of people in the way that they communicate with each other, whether they've come from a narcissistic family or not. Many people using denial, acting out, compartmentalization, projection, minimization, repression, displacement. We see all of these all the time in the people around us in society. So good to be aware of exactly what's happening so we can break it down and get to understand more what's going on for us and other people. So I hope that was interesting, and the next video is going to be about avoidance, which is more specific to when people have been through trauma. So take care of yourselves and bye.